Well, for the chief warrior and the spear carrier, international law and rules of world order are double-edged. They're imposed with much self-righteous rhetoric on others, but they're dismissed as irrelevant for themselves. Now, that's nothing novel about that. Throughout history, that stance is familiar on the part of those who believe that they have unchallengeable power. And the consequences of that are well enough known, so I don't have to review them. But it's important to bear in mind that historical analogies have very little force because the stakes now are so much higher. The issues are similar, but the stakes are qualitatively different, namely literal survival. Well, McGuire is joined by a great many others in mourning of the virtual inevitability of nuclear war under current policies. One of them is Robert McNamara, Kennedy Johnson Defense Secretary, who recently recalled that the world came within a hair's breadth of nuclear disaster during the missile crisis of 1962. And just to bring that up to date, that part of one of the reasons for that, one of the causes of that hair's breadth of nuclear disaster was a major terrorist war. Kennedy's war against Cuba still going on, though not in the same way. And McNamara warned that the threat of 1962, which was a very close call, is once again extremely severe. He went on to warn of what he called apocalypse soon, unless there's a sharp change, I'm quoting him, in current U.S. nuclear weapons policy, which is immoral, illegal, militarily unnecessary, and dreadfully dangerous, creating unacceptable risks to other nations and to our own, both the risk of accidental or inadvertent nuclear launch, which is unacceptably high and increasing, and of nuclear attack by terrorists. McNamara endorsed the judgment of William Perry, Clinton's defense secretary, that there's a greater than 50% probability of a nuclear strike on the United States on U.S. targets within a decade. He's here referring to a dirty bomb, not a major nuclear, just end of civilization nuclear attack. Those threats are all well understood, and they're being very consciously enhanced, not because planners want the consequences, but because they don't rank very high in the ranking of priorities. They don't want them, but they're just not that important. Nowhere near as important as stuffing the pockets of your rich friends with dollars and shaking a fist at the world and making sure that people do what you want. The Iraq War is only the most blatant example. Another well-known strategic analyst at Harvard University's Graham Allison reports what he calls the consensus in the national security community, of which he's been a part, that a dirty bomb attack is inevitable and an attack with a nuclear weapon, full-scale war, highly likely if fissionable materials, which are the critical ingredient, are not recovered and if there is no termination of their production. Well, I'll come back to the critical question of controlling production. On retrieving fissionable materials, there has actually been some progress since the early 90s. That's mainly under the initiatives of Senators Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar. But Cheney, Rumsfeld, and the rest put to the side the programs to avoid inevitable nuclear terror, just as they sidelined the so-called war on terror, so that they could devote their energies to driving the country to war, and then efforts to try to contain somehow the catastrophe that they created in Iraq. In the very sober Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, two prominent strategic analysts warned that Bush administration military programs and its aggressive stance carry an appreciable risk of ultimate doom. And they outlined the reasons, which should be familiar to us. Pursuit of total security by one state entails the insecurity of others. They are almost certain to react. They will make use of the terrifying technology that's being developed in Rumsfeld's transformation of the military, which, as they point out, will assuredly diffuse to the rest of the world. And in the context of competition and intimidation, the action-reaction cycle creates rising dangers, potentially and unmanageable ones. Hence, transformation of the military, as currently being practiced, carries an appreciable risk of ultimate doom. These are all quotes from the most respectable and sober of sources. The authors express the hope that the threat that the U.S. government is posing to its own population and to the world will be countered by a coalition of peace-loving nations led by China. Notice that they don't even consider the possibility that the threat might be overcome by the people of the United States. That bears on the fourth crisis that I mentioned. We've come to a pretty pass when thoughts like that are expressed right at the heart of the establishment. They bring up China because of all of the nuclear states. It has, as they point out, maintained by far the most restrained pattern of military deployment. And further, China has led the efforts of the United Nations for the past few years to overcome the unilateral U.S. refusal to preserve space for peaceful purposes. It goes back to the Clinton years, origins are in the Reagan years. The Clinton administration refused to join the rest of the world, Israel accepted, in renewal and extension of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which tried to reserve space for peaceful uses. And the Clinton administration immobilized the United Nations Disarmament Commission by barring any moves towards prevention of an arms race in outer space. And the reasons for that were quite explicit. Clinton's Space Command, I'll quote it, called for dominating the space dimension of military operations to protect U.S. interest and investment, much in the way that armies and navies did in earlier years, but this time with a sole hegemon, which must develop space-based strike weapons, enabling the application of precision force from, to, and through space. Again, in the Clinton years, U.S. intelligence and the Space Command agreed that such measures will be necessary because, in their words, globalization of the world economy will lead to a widening economic divide, along with deepening economic stagnation, political instability, and cultural alienation, hence unrest and violence among the have-nots, much of it directed against the United States, which they will rightly see as the source of much of their travail. Therefore, they go on to say, the U.S. must be prepared for precision strike from space as a counter to the worldwide proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, which is, in fact, the likely consequence of the recommended military programs, just as the widening divide is the anticipated consequence of the specific version of international integration that's misleadingly called globalization and free trade and the doctrinal system. Actually, neither. The space program falls within the framework of the officially, though quietly announced Clinton doctrine that the United States is entitled, quoting, to resort to unilateral use of military power to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. That's Clinton. And notice that it's more extreme than the Bush doctrine. But there was very little protest about it. The reason is that it was presented quietly, without bombast, so therefore overlooked, except by the world that has to face these consequences.